Welcome. I don't know if you guys can all hear me, hopefully. We'll wait for, it looks like there's 12 or 13 people that have signed up. Maybe just a couple more minutes. All right, maybe it's better to start. All right. So I guess I don't need these if nobody else is talking. I'd hoped to get a really fancy slide show on, but it doesn't look like it's working, and I'm not sure how to present it. But it's okay, we'll adapt. All right. Well, you know what? Actually, maybe I know what it is. Maybe I'm using the background and I shouldn't do that. There we go. Ha, I knew it. All right. Good. Makes me so happy when I do things badly and then fix it. All right. Can you guys all see this? Does this look not backwards to you? Okay, great. How do I make it not backwards for me? Oh, whatever. I'll make do. It'll be funny. Here we go. Okay. So tonight's topic, obviously, breast cancer. You know, for October, I think it's nice for all of us to spend some time appreciating this. It's these days affecting 1 in 10 women. You know, so it's a pretty prevalent disease. And quite devastating. You know, most of us probably know someone who is either directly or indirectly affected. It also happens to be the most common malignant disease among Western women. And that's a pretty powerful statement. I mean, these days we're all thinking about coronavirus and how sort of were impacted globally. But imagine that on top of the horror of the virus, there are women and men who are dealing with breast cancer as well. And maybe that's an important thing to highlight, actually, because a lot of people associate breast cancer with only women. But men, of course, have breast tissue as well, and can be affected. And in especially in our culture, that's not as permissive of men to be ill and to be, I guess, affected by illness. You can imagine how difficult breast cancer is for those men. All right, so let's dig in. How do I switch slides? Okay, so we got the title. So my goal tonight is to talk about basically overview of sort of the types of breast cancer there are. It's pretty brief, but I assume some people don't know and might be interested. And maybe that'll be a source of questions. And of course, we'll talk about where cannabis fits into that relative to other treatments. I'll talk about the different sort of options for consuming cannabis as it affects breast cancer, and sort of what expectations should be. And then, with respect to safety, there are some things to learn and to know. Like most things in medicine, there's no clear one-sided story, although most of it is good. I'll save the suspense. I'll talk about a couple examples of some patients that I have who've been dealing with breast cancer and are using cannabis as well. And then for anybody who has interest in learning more, we're trying to provide all the resources we can for people, not just this way through video, but we have blogs, we have a library of literature, and people can read and learn more. This link that I have up here, I don't know if I'll be able to point. This link here is a folder that I put together that has, I don't know, close to 100 different articles where you could search about topics within breast cancer that might interest you. You can look for pictures if you want to sort of look through the pictures and tables. But anyway, it's all free for anybody who wants. Okay, so breast cancer affects, there are basically three types of breast cancer. There are breast cancers which are hormone receptive, meaning estrogen receptive generally. And these, if you think about normal cells gone wrong, when breast tissue responds to its communication environment, it's stimulated by local hormones, and one of those hormones can be estrogen. If normal cells go haywire, if something in the system of the cell malfunctions and it becomes no longer receptive to normal signals, and maybe one of those malfunctions is the reproduce signal gets amplified, if you want to sort of oversimplify it. That's where a tumor comes from. It's originally generally a normal cell that has some kind of error in it, and one of those errors can be that it grows heavily. Maybe one of those, maybe another error is it has the power to pierce through tissue. So maybe it doesn't just stay in breast tissue, maybe it travels somewhere else. It might be local into the chest wall, it might be distal to a sort of metastatic picture, but that's a different error in the cell that enables it to do that. When breast cancer is hormone receptor positive, what we would say, meaning it is affected. It has receptors that are affectable. We have some choices. We can eliminate the estrogen, and for some women that means getting rid of their ovaries, either physically or chemically. Tamoxifen is a medicine some people might have heard of, which does basically interrupts, the ability for the hormone to reach the breast. It essentially causes menopause in these women, who might be young and might be fertile and until their estrogen is removed. But for the sake of cancer and the potential to be quite lethal, that's a horrible choice that some women have to make, some men too. Although men, different story. So there's hormone receptor positive, and then the second type is HER2 positive. All cells, whether they're in the breast or anywhere, have a communication system. They communicate with the outside, they communicate inside the cell, and there's a communication chain that runs from the outside to the inside. So it's a sort of, we call it a transmembrane or transduction signal. Basically, it's a game of tag, and there's someone hanging out on the outside of a cell. And when someone comes on and connects with their hand, they change color, say, and then reach inside the cell and connect with something else that changes into a different color. And all of a sudden you have a cascade, which creates an effect. It could be an effect on one of the subcomponents of a cell. It could be, transmitting right down to the DNA and changing the way that the cell is reading its DNA or translating its DNA. But that cascade, that sort of tag game, one of those pieces in the cell is called HER2. It's not easy to simplify these things, but basically it's a growth factor receptor. And if you think about it in those terms, when it gets a certain signal, it promotes growth. If that one goes haywire, you have cancer growth. In this case, treatment is a little bit different than the hormone receptor treatment. Right now, there are what are called biologics. These are monoclonal antibodies, which basically attack these sort of receptor systems and stop them from functioning. It works pretty well, and generally these women do well until of course there's a mutation and something goes wrong, and then we have to adapt again, or if some other mutation creates a different reason for the cell to multiply. So type 1 is the hormone receptors. Type 2 is these HER2 positive cancers, and the third is triple negative, which is basically it's not responding to any of the usual treatments. That it's not there isn't a clear path to treat it. Basically, is the triple negative. Obviously, these are the least likely to the patients with triple negative are least likely to do well because we don't have very clear receptors to be able to target and help them. Cannabis, to get to the punchline, has shown some pretty remarkable things. Historically, we have a frozen mummy, I guess she would be, who might be 2,000 plus years old, who actually has a leather purse attached to her with cannabis, and she happened to have breast cancer. So this is old school in the human story, and it's been sort of known to humans, over millennia, for different reasons. I don't think people back in the day, I mean, who knows? But my hunch is that they didn't know that it treated breast cancer. They probably felt better when they were taking it. They probably slept better, and that was, why they associated with, something maybe painful in the chest, and they would take cannabis, or maybe that was what everybody did back in the day. Who knows? But anyway, it's been part of culture for a long time. And now, as folklore, I guess, has passed up the food chain to physicians and researchers, they've done some research, and they have basically seen that cannabis can interact with this cell chain, the tag game, in different ways. Some of the ways undo the damage of the cancer. One of the things that cancer can sometimes do is stop the cell from killing itself. One of the automatic safety tools that we have is called apoptosis, which is where a cell, when something is wrong, commits suicide. And that's actually a signaling system, a communication system, just like everything else we're talking about. But that system can go haywire. And when apoptosis no longer is live, when it no longer works, the cell kind of lives forever and keeps doing the other things that the cell does, which is multiply and travel. Cannabis as a signaling molecule. So cannabis is, I don't know if we call it a hulk on the top of the cell. It could maybe grab one of those hands that's outside the cell and can force a change in the wiring of the cell. I mean, this is sort of silly analogy, but basically it's, for whatever reasons, and we don't know the reasons, can reactivate apoptosis in some of these cells that have been rewired. So what we see in some cases when people are taking cannabis and there's a cancer cell involved, is actually that the normal cells, which are used to cannabis and can interact with cannabis, and it's not a big deal, they're not affected badly. They don't, it doesn't switch on suicide for the normal cells. It does switch on suicide for the cancer cells. Which is a really nice situation when you have someone with cancer and they don't want to kill the healthy cells, they only want to kill the bad cells. So that does happen. The apoptosis stuff happens. In other situations, different tag team actors are affected, are inhibited or stopped from working. At this point, maybe it's better if I start bringing in pictures. Because talking about tag teaming seems a little silly. Okay, so this is an example of hormone receptor positive breast cancer cells, and what you see up here, my background is going to get lost. Okay, but I'll describe it. What you see up above is cannabinoids are acting on. In this case, you can see CB1, CB2. These are cannabinoid receptors. The truth is, actually, we know that happens, that CB1 and CB2 are activated by cannabis, but there are also a bunch of other areas where cells are impacted, and we don't quite understand what they are. So we know that these things happen, but we also know that there's other stuff that happens. And the way we know that, which is really interesting, is we sometimes have animals which don't have CB1 and CB2. We knock them out. These are animals that are bred for that. And yet somehow they still have positive effect. So we know quite clearly that there's something else going on, but we don't know exactly how it is and what. But anyway, back to the picture, we can see when CB1 and CB2 are activated, you can see that they stop different elements of normal cell actions. The big circle with the blue ring attached to the red ring and the green ring, that's a cell cycle, meaning a cell is starting from nothing, is multiplying, is dividing, is becoming new cells. Sometimes, as I was alluding to, cancer can stop that cycle, can screw that up. And cannabis can interfere in this pathway. Suffice to say, I think the point is clear. What you can see here is lots of complexity, and nobody has to know all this complexity. I think most doctors don't even really know the nuances here. I mean, a lot of this is just understanding the big picture. And if you look at the red crosses, there are many parts of the normal cell cycle and abnormal cancer cell cycles which are impacted, which are stopped when the cannabinoid signaling pathway is activated. Okay. This one is the HER2 positive breast cancers. And the punchline is actually the same here, although the exact method is a little bit different. You know, in HER2, for some research, it's shown that CB2 is the receptor. CB1 doesn't really impact this pathway. But in a similar way, when these receptors are activated, when cannabis is present, you get interruption of these abnormal cell actions. Oops. Okay, here's triple negative. No surprise, same kind of story. Some of these actors in these malfunctioning cells are again impacted by cannabis. The cannabinoids are stopping them or sort of throwing a wrench in the normal, well, in the abnormal cell normal cycle. This sort of picture comes up in about 1,000 different papers. You know, these letters and stuff are basically symbolizing the different tag team members. But if you think about it in terms of just general cell function and communication, which is in and out, throwing in cannabis around a cell interrupts the normal cell communication. For bad cells, it causes destruction. And for good cells, it doesn't seem to do that much, which is harmful. Most of the time, but we'll cover that in a sec. Okay, so this is a good pause point. I have a couple other sort of tracks to talk about, not too many, but I wanted to take a pause. If people have questions, you can either raise your hand and I can kind of let you talk, or if you want to just write a question in the chat, that also works. And if I don't get anything, I'll just move on. This is where I need that iPhone ... where you can see where people are typing or not typing. Maybe not. Okay, so I guess I'll move on. One of the things to be wary of, I guess. So we see, you know, this is great. Seems like cannabis is doing its job in a good way. It's protecting the good cells. It's killing the bad cells. It seems awesome. Why isn't everybody on cannabis? Why isn't this a mainstream thing? That basically opens up a huge can of political and legal worms. In most countries, this is just, it's been a suffocation of research and sort of logic around studying it. So the normal pathways of approving medicines haven't been checked, and you know, we can't just let a wild worm, I guess, into the mix. But this is certainly coming. I think most people who are wise and all of the most up-to-date oncologists are aware of this. Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, for example, is generally seen to be one of the leaders in cancer therapy in the world. Is one of the places where they're embracing cannabis and understand the benefit, even though as a partially publicly funded organization, they have to be, you know, smart about the way that they vocalize it. But the picture is not all rosy. You know, one of the things to, I guess, understand is that there has been some evidence of pro-tumor effects of cannabis in breast cancer. And what that means, obviously, pro-tumor means something is promoting the tumor, is favoring the tumor, is supporting the tumor with respect to cannabinoids. And the science is quite complicated. You know, it's mostly in animal studies that we have seen this, where, you know, they prepare this cute little animal, rat, mouse usually. Sometimes they inject cancer, they have local cancers, and then they, administer cannabis in some way. And most of the story is, oh, this cancer is being killed by cannabis. There have been a couple studies where they inject this cancer into mice which have a healthy immune system, and different mice which have an unhealthy, have no immune system. And then they also then administer cannabis in both scenarios. So one of these mice has an immune system, a healthy working immune system. The other set of mice don't. And what they saw was, in the situation where there was an immune system, that cannabis can sometimes suppress that immune system. And we know that cannabis helps to some degree, and we know actually our immune system is constantly fighting. I mean, whenever you have an illness, whether it's a viral infection or bacteria infection or cancer, your body sends its armies, and it might be different armies, but it's basically fighting the bad guys. And when you have bad guys to fight the cancer, sometimes the bad guys win. I mean, there are people who have cancer and their body resolves it the old-fashioned way with our innate immunity. If you don't have immunity, like those mice that, for whom the immunity was taken away, sometimes you don't kill those cancers. And in other cases, cannabis can actually suppress immunity. One of the things that cannabis does, which is remarkable, is that it has anti-inflammation capacity. When your back is hurting, one of the reasons that cannabis can be helpful is that it actually impacts your body's inflammatory system, and it sort of calms things down. For people who have overactive immune systems, so who have autoimmunity, that can be very important. It helps them sort of hush down the immune system using something which is more appealing perhaps than steroids or other strong medicines. In the case of some breast cancers, the suppression of immunity has led to cancers growing, being pro-tumor as opposed to a nice optimal picture. So it's something that needs to be worked out. I mean, we're not even at the starting line for thinking about where this will be, but it is something to be mindful of. And as that literature has creeped into the scientific dialogue, and you can be sure with the social political pressures against cannabis that this gets more press than the good stuff, horribly. But it is important to know. So that's one way that cannabis can be pro tumor, can have a pro-tumor effect. The other is more of a theory. So that's one idea which is well accepted in these small circles. Another interesting idea is cannabis has what's called a biphasic effect. Some people have noticed that when they take a small dose of something like CBD, well, maybe it doesn't work. But if they take a larger dose, it does work. And to some extent, that's a terrible example because, well, more might be better and you just needed more. But there are some times when you have more around, the effect changes. And to simplify things, when you have a certain army, a certain small army, maybe it does one job. But if you have a much, much bigger army, it does a very different job. Not a good example, but it's hard to come up with a good one. But anyway, what we have seen with this example is that in low doses, sometimes cannabinoids can be pro-tumor, but in higher doses, they have much more anti-proliferative, meaning they're better effect at stopping proliferation of these cancer cells. So there might be a certain number of these soldiers which have to be there in order for the cancer to really wane. And if that number is not sufficient, then you actually get more pro-tumor because maybe the immune system suppressing function is a sooner effect. Nobody really knows yet. Okay. So we have a question. I'll jump there as a break from hearing my own sort of thought pattern. Okay, does the strength or type of cannabis make a difference in the destruction of cells? Yes. So some certain cannabinoids, certain ingredients, certain components of cannabis bind to different things. We live in a unfortunate reality right now, which is with respect to cannabis, humans over the last two odd thousand years have bred cannabis, which had been a wild horse, all kinds of different things going on inside. We bred that wild horse to be very two-sided, two-faced. One is THC, which people have loved being high, and they had spiritual experiences, and it became a religious thing, and it became a cultural thing, and it became a fun thing for humankind. And then CBD is also there and has its own benefits. And people thousands of years ago recognized that, and the farmers that be bred these two very distinct products, but cannabis really has closer to maybe 500 different subcomponents that have been bred out at the expense of, at the foot of THC and CBD. So what I'm trying to say is the market right now only gives us two tools. Walking into a pharmacy or a pharmacy store, you only have toilet paper and toothpaste as choices right now. I mean, we have bred out everything else because we're only thinking about those things. So that being said, the conversation we can have practically is different than the one we have theoretically. So theoretically, cannabis has an amazing arsenal of nuanced differences, which very likely have meaningful differences in the conversation we're talking about, the fighting cancer stuff. But a lot of that stuff is just going to be, is years away because it's not mainstream. It doesn't sell, and the retail world can't make money from it. So until research is able to sell a meaningful story, the consumer markets aren't going to support it. So given the reality, which is CBD and THC dominate everything, they do have different functions. CBD can block the destruction of our natural anandamide. Anandamide is this pleasure molecule. It's sort of the inborn THC, if you want to think about it that way. CBD can actually block its destruction. THC can't do that. Also, THC can bind the receptors that anandamide does, this pleasure molecule, obviously. Well, obviously to most people these days. CBD does bind, but very badly. And actually CBD can block it. So it does both. It binds a little bit and it blocks. So the effects that these two compounds have, we as a culture understand that, oh, CBD doesn't make me high, THC makes me high. But they have more nuanced scientific differences. As far as which one does which action, some of the slides I showed you before, I hope that you skipped over that stuff because it's so complicated. But in this slide, you can see CB1 and CB2 have action. Doesn't matter what they have action for, they have action. This one, only CB2 has action. CB1 is not there. And then this one has both. So in some cases, certain cancer cells respond to CB1, in other cases CB2, and that, when you back up a little bit, impacts which cannabinoid is going to have action and which one will not. I think that's probably a more useful description. I mean, you know, there is no, oh, you should take this if you have cancer. There's no magic formula now. You know, most of the way that people use this stuff is the same way we have been for thousands of years. We sort of throw some options out there. It's like a little bit of trial and error. You know, when people have cancer and they come to cannabis looking for treatment, what they're doing right now, we don't have this cannabis fights this cancer. You know, the bullseye doesn't exist. We don't have an arrow that leads to one bullseye. What we have is a target which is across the river, and there's a huge hurricane between. There's so much other stuff happening between a direct line of cannabis and killing a cancer that if people get it right, it's a little bit lucky. And what people do instead is say, well, to hell with it. I'll just fight with 50 arrows. And people take a shotgun. And the analogy there is people take all of cannabis, not just one molecule. They take all of it and they put it in a blender and they consume it en masse, a sort of massive concentrate of the whole plant. And it's quite powerful, it's quite strong. And the idea is, well, hopefully something in there is the right compound that's going to hit that target. That's as good as we got right now. You know, there are pharmaceutical grade cannabinoids, but they don't really work very well. They're marketed for multiple sclerosis or for nauseousness, for appetite, you know, if you have cancer, but they're not marketed because they don't have effect with these cancer things. When we do look at them, you know, they haven't been looked at, formally for fighting cancer, but they wouldn't work, I think, even if they were. They're just too pure because part of making a pharmaceutical is that it has to be reproducible. It has to be ultimately pure so that you can judge its safety. So we're not there yet. So that sort of gets at the type of cannabis making a difference. The strength, yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of the biphasic stuff that I was talking about, that it's small doses. We worry that there could be pro-cannabis. I mean, this is just from limited data that we have. So we're kind of looking at this target with one eye closed and a sheet over our head. But what we can see is that higher doses seem to make a big difference. In practical reality, in life, we see when people take high doses of cannabis, they tend to do better than people who are taking lower doses. So it seems like there's something there with strength, but that's really the best that we got. You know, one of the other things to mention, I guess, maybe should have mentioned before, is, you know, cannabis might be working, but normal medicine, tried and true chemotherapy, radiation therapy, surgical treatments, we know they work. They don't work all the time, but it's not a maybe. You know, these are things which do work with a certain regularity. We've studied these. These are a normal part of Western medicine. They've been subject to extreme rigor. Normal therapy it does work. It's not a maybe. And if cannabis maybe works, and it doesn't have terrible harms, you know, obviously there's a risk of some concerns, but it's not terrible, and it seems like it's avoidable. It seems like, you know, if something was pro-tumor, you could stop. So you have control over it. So if you have it does work and you have a maybe, combining the two is the logical way to proceed. You know, until we get to the day where we know this cannabis hits that target. Sorry, this cannabis hits that target. The sensible thing to do, the healthy thing to do, is to trust science in the last, you know, 300 years. And then if you feel like you want to add something which doesn't seem to have for much harm and might offer tremendous benefit, that's logical. You're not taking away bad things and sort of leaping with faith. You're using, you know, science and hope. Okay, so a very long answer to that question. So hopefully that gets at it. So another question here was, do synthetic cannabinoids offer the same effects as naturally derived cannabis products. So synthetic cannabinoids is a terrible term. Colloquially, like in our culture, we use it to mean good things. We use it to mean bad things. When most people are talking about synthetic cannabinoids, they might be thinking about spice. So K2 is this THC compound, which is ultra pure. There's been some controversy that it was made overseas and it's shipped here because it's a really cheap way to get a high. So people generally on the street who are consuming illegal cannabis would get an awesome high, and it wouldn't cost very much, but then they would die because this synthetic cannabinoid just does not agree with human life. So some synthetics that we know on the street were killing people and have been killing people. It still happens today, unfortunately. And part of that is because of the market, that these products are so cheap and they're sustainable because they're generally in powder form. That people who can't grow cannabis or can afford to sort of keep it and participate in a commercial market, throw K2 in there because it feels good and they get good business, but obviously it has these catastrophic effects. So that's bad synthetic cannabinoid, cannabis. You also have pharmaceutical companies which make pharmaceutical cannabis, which is really synthetic. They're talking about, big cauldrons of chemistry, which go through lots of fun tubing and bubbling and create a powder at the end, which is synthetic cannabis. And it's not the same synthetic cannabis as K2 or the stuff that's produced overseas. It's not as ultra pure, honestly, but it's also physically a little bit different and not deadly. And these are the kinds of things that go into, so that kind of synthetic process is what goes into giving you an aspirin or an ibuprofen or a Tylenol. And similarly, those are the kinds of things that go into to cannabis medicines. They are almost by definition, in the United States and in most countries, you can't produce a product which is a mishmash of lots of stuff, because that mishmash might not be predictable. We don't know if certain components are going to react in a bad way and hurt someone. So in order to clean the slate, to make things understandable and predictable, when you, as a pharmaceutical company, make a synthetic product or make a medicine, it can only have a very, very limited number of ingredients. Maybe one, maybe two, almost unheard of 3. That buys you predictability. It buys you consistency. You know what's going to happen. You've tried it on 10,000 people. That's what phase trials are. When we're talking these days about coronavirus, they talk about these, it has to go through trials. It's basically guinea pigs, if you think about it that way. The people volunteer to say, okay, I want this virus treatment, this vaccine to work. I'm willing to give it a try. The benefit to them is, maybe they have a vaccine for, in this case, coronavirus, but the risk is sometimes something might go wrong. So the medicines that we have, in this country, throughout the world, are to the benefit or because of, people's sacrifices who have given it a try. In order to subject people to these kinds of trials, you have to predict that it's not going to kill them. And that's why these medicines have so few ingredients. Contrast that with the natural plant, which has 500 to 1,000 components. And that's not something you can throw in a pill. It's not something that you can really study with any specific mathematical direction, no certainty. It's almost gambling with nature. And fortunately, we know that over the thousands of years people have been using this stuff, that they've done well. That we don't have the idea that, oh, that's a cannabis death. We haven't seen that. We've seen people have bad effects, but not catastrophic ones. Same way that some medicines have. So, do they offer the same effects? No. So when these have been studied against one another, when the pharmaceutical pure stuff has been is given to someone with an illness, or a bunch of people with the same illness. And then a different group of people are given a whole plant almost exclusively, almost across the board, almost every time. The whole plant wins out. People feel better. The disease is treated better, almost without variation, almost without exception. There are some cases where someone has a very, very narrow problem, like they might have only nauseousness. In that case, maybe a pure product would do better for them. But that laser precise targeting is not a common thing in illnesses. Most of the time, if your back hurts, you're also not sleeping, you're also pretty stressed out about it. And then if you're walking bad, maybe your hip is going to start hurting. So there's, most illnesses have multifactorial dimensions to them. And perhaps because of that, the whole plant addresses more things in a way that's better than purified. A really long answer. All right. So I'll move on to a last stage. There's not going to be much left because looks like toward the end of an hour. But so far we've talked about how cannabis can impact the disease process, the disease, the errant problems inside a cancer cell. But when someone has breast cancer, and they're on tamoxifen, the anti-estrogen medicine, they might have hot flashes. Or maybe the breast cancer surgery they had is causing pain. There are all kinds of, or they're depressed about it, feeling that they're fighting this terminal illness. All of these things can lead to other problems. I mean, we sort of just alluded to this in the sort of multifactorial stuff that, the cancer is not just a one-track train. And if you have a medicine like cannabis, which can help people sleep better, which can help them feel more joy or distract them from feeling pain or feeling depressed, that can be miraculous. That can be a treatment in and of itself. And that's, I think, not to be underestimated. I think we'd like to think of medicines as, oh, this vaccine treats this virus in a very A to B kind of way. But really, humans are not like that. And when you have A, you also have B through Z. And there's a lot of other things going on that are maybe not as high priority or not as noticeable. But we're not so simple as machines. And cannabis, which is also not so simple, can have multi-dimensional effects. And whether it's helping an appetite, helping fatigue, helping depression, those are really meaningful treatments. And it, sadly, I guess, our culture, because it has our medical culture, because it's so high on itself, about we can stop broken bones, we can stop eye pressure, and we sort of feel this powerful ability to attack a problem with a single solution. We've become really short-sighted. And of course, doctors don't talk to their patients anymore. They give, oh, you have anxiety, here's a pill. Oh, you have bipolar disorder, here's a different pill. And they sort of have forgotten that people are people, and that we aren't one-dimensional, and that we're not just depression or bipolar disorder or whatever. And the fact that cannabis does this is a really interesting, I think, cultural thing, a cultural phenomenon, where this is not A to B. And this really is forcing physicians and all of us to see that this is a whole alphabet thing. And that someone with breast cancer can hope that the cancer will be fixed. But they can also approach cannabis as, maybe this is going to help my sleep or my stress or my depression or all these other things. And maybe they get lucky and it also works for the cancer. It's a really fascinating time, and obviously a fascinating field, which is why I'm here. So yeah, I mean, our culture, this slide was just to illustrate that we already do this. We already think about other ways of treating an illness. When you have depression, you might start doing yoga, you might start running, you might start listening to podcasts or something. And cannabis is doing this chemically. And this is not so important. All right. Any questions? We have 10 minutes left. Hopefully I haven't put everybody to sleep. All right, good. Another question. As a cannabis nurse researcher, it's a fascinating science. I'm excited about the discoveries that inform practice almost every week. Yeah. So actually, maybe I forgot to mention the sort of experience that I have with patients. So I have, I don't know, 50, hundreds, maybe up to 500 patients who are either terminal cancer or have some sort of minor cancer. I would say, I don't know, a little over half, 30 of those. If it's 50, I don't really keep track that closely, but 30 folks who have breast cancer. I can't say all the news is good. I've had some patients who sadly have not made it. But the vast majority of patients have felt like cannabis has brought them much more joy in their life, certainly much better quality of life. For the folks who have survived, almost all of them are not only doing cannabis, they're doing, Western medicine as well. And I work closely with physicians at Dana-Farber supporting that. So I don't know that I would give cannabis that much credit. I think it probably does impact the treatment somewhat, but I'm not quite yet to call it a holy grail or anything like that. I think I as a normal family doctor, I can't let myself sort of jump off the deep end there. But I think it is silly for anybody who is experiencing illness, whether it's breast cancer or any illness, to not look into cannabis, to not consider it. I think we are fighting an uphill battle because our culture has really demonized anybody for thinking about cannabis. In this pathway to insanity. But I think it's honestly unethical for doctors not to be engaging with cannabis. I think it's an important part of medical care. I think it's an important part of being a altruistic human as a provider. And I think we're going to get there. I think people are just starting to realize it. I mean, even in the last 3 years, the medical culture has shifted from physicians who say, "Oh, don't do that stuff. That's only for losers and addicts." And that shifted to, okay, if you're going to do it, I don't want to hear about it. Sort of don't ask, don't tell. And then actually in the last year or two, I'm starting to see patients for cannabis before they're even prescribed other medicines. I mean, it's really insane. I mean, it makes me feel a lot of pressure, but it's joyful. I think, these are patients who taking cannabis are feeling good about their medicine. Imagine that you take something and you actually like it. But it's exciting also that physicians are recognizing that it is safe, that it is beneficial, and that people really like it. And ultimately it's a story about what people are responding to. Okay, we have another question. Any medical organizations focused on cancer or oncology making progress in this cannabis space? Yeah, there's a lot of progress. Unfortunately, it's a lot of islands that are disconnected from one another. Israel has a great respect for cannabis, and its scientific community is not shunned for it. And there's a lot of interest in South America. There's a lot of interest in Eastern Europe. Australia is even kind of up in the ball game. The United States has certainly researchers who are fascinated by it, and researchers in all kinds of different domains. So we have researchers who study animals and how it's working there. We have researchers who look into the chemistry and how is this stuff working in a petri dish. And all of these different components are vital to medicine. Western medicine is what it is, not simply because someone came up with the whole idea and put it into action right away. Medicine is what it is because we all have kind of worked together. And up until the 50s, really, cannabis was a normal part of Western medicine. And a lot of it was, back in the days of apothecaries, where you'd mix something up and, we know culturally that this worked. We didn't really know why. We didn't have the bench science. We didn't have the chemistry science to say why it worked. But doctors knew that it worked because we have experience and we see patients for whom it's working. and we can then relay that as sort of old doctors used to do. These days, because research has been suffocated, you know, doctors, scientists need special licenses to have access to a supply of cannabis which is allowed in this country. And it's just, I mean, it's just been such a horrible system. And even the product they could study once they had licenses was terrible. It's been a disaster. So what we know is A, based on terrible weed. B, it's a discombobulated communication among all these researchers and clinicians. And C, it's just, it's nowhere near the rest of Western medicine. You know, that people come to me sometimes saying, well, okay, tell me about how it's going to interact with this medicine, and tell me how it's going to do this, and how long should I expect this to work, and how long do I have to take it, and how many times a day? And there's so many questions that we are used to asking because that's how we understand medicine. In medicine, we should understand everything. We should understand, if I gave this to my animal, how it would work on them. I mean, we sort of expect us to know everything. And here we're starting barely at the beginning. And we don't know a lot. We just know from experience. We know from, you know, what we hear on the street. To some extent, we have these animal trials and chemistry studies that make us feel confident to move forward, but we don't know very much. So yes, there are organizations, but they're in islands. And you know, one of the things I always, I'd laugh, but it's also sad. There's a massive library of medical literature. There's a huge army of studies that nobody's reading. I mean, if you think about all the scientists over the last 200 years, really, they've poured blood and sweat over their whole lifetimes to teach other scientists, to teach the public about whatever it was about their interest, whether it was studying mice or studying how iPhones work or whatever it was, and they publish it. And it just lives in this online database now. I mean, thankfully we do have access to it, but it used to live in just a library. And if nobody's looking that stuff up, if nobody's reading it, it's lost. And this is a tragedy that I didn't even appreciate until I'm sort of knee deep in the cannabis world. There's so much out there that nobody even reads. So thinking about that nobody's reading this stockpile, this whole library, and nobody's communicating because the silly governments aren't letting us communicate. It's just a recipe for failure. You know, and I think maybe people in the world appreciate that with what's happened in the United States during coronavirus. That when we don't have effective leadership, you know, whether it's, you know, racism in the 30s, you know, making cannabis a racist thing, or coronavirus in the 2000s or 2020s, it's, you know, we need effective leadership. All right, another question. I don't want to get too political. Do you think medical cannabis would become more of a choice than recreational? My question really is, medical going to survive or recreational will take over? It's a great question. I have a couple answers to it, a couple of perspectives on it. First of all, I think there's no such thing as medical. There's no such thing as recreational. These are artificial terms that we have adopted to make people feel bad or okay. You know, the reason we have a medical program, a medical system, is because politicians, lobbyists could make a really effective argument that, you know, this child in front of you is going to die. And are you really going to deny them medicine which could help? I mean, they only have a month to live. How can you let them not have this medicine? You know, and at the end of your life, you should be able to do whatever you want. If you want to poke your eyes out, you should be able to do that. If you want to smoke a joint, you should be able to do that. And it became an effective legal argument, sort of, to make laws allowed so that people could do medicine if they want to. You know, recreational is a term where, you know, it's sort of judgmental. You know, like, are you having fun with it? You know, if you're an awkward teenager at a party and you don't like talking to people and you don't feel good about yourself, and you take something recreationally because the doctor isn't prescribing, it's not, you know, officially medical, but then you feel comfortable. You maybe feel more comfortable in your own skin, or you feel comfortable talking or flirting or whatever it is. That's sort of a medical use. I mean, it just depends on how you're looking at it. You know, if you look at it as some hoodlum kid who's just smoking a joint, that's a judgmental view. If you look at it, maybe their parents are beating them. Maybe they don't have any money at home. Maybe they're starving and they're doing this to feel better. It's not so terrible. You know, I think we as a culture are so mean to one another. So to that end, the divisions are very much alive and well, partly because we still have this crazy legal infrastructure with these crazy legal systems. My hunch is over time, the recreational cannabis will survive because cannabis is just a normal part of culture. You know, maybe it won't be called recreational, it would just be called that's cannabis soda or that's cannabis seltzer or something. The same way that we don't think about beer as recreational or alcohol. I guess sometimes we do, but we think about it just a normal part of culture. And I think medical will evolve and people will appreciate the depth of opportunity that cannabis has to be a medicine. And I think doctors are going to start learning about it more, and we're going to have hopefully a medical specialty where, you know, folks like me who are passionate and care and want to learn about it can have a place and help people. And other, you know, just like a dermatologist or radiologist has a focus. You know, this is my focus, and I think this is where the future will be. All right. 8:32, we're all done. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the attendance. Hopefully this was interesting. It's not so much feedback, so a little bit talking to myself, but if you have questions, you can always hit me up. You know, we have a whole database of questions. It's questions@cedclinic.com. We have a whole website too, which has lots of useful information. Everything there is free. Not only a library of medical literature, as I mentioned, but you know, we have infographics, we have blog posts, we have all kinds of different things. Someone's comment is they're gonna take a gummy and watch CNN. Yeah, maybe you need a few. These days, it's depressing what people have done to each other. But anyway, thank you all for coming. Hopefully you'll get to join the others in the future. We're doing these more or less every week. We're going to start doing some really interesting stuff, inviting some chefs on to talk about cooking, inviting some growers to talk about growing, invite some other doctors to hear their perspectives. And maybe we'll invite some patients and sort of, you know, people that might be comfortable talking about their experience. Because I think what we have to do is just make this normal. It's not a big deal. It's just part of human culture, and I'm trying to do my part. So thank you for doing yours, which is participating. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a great night. Stay safe.